welcome to Team Reality Origin Stories, Chapter B. Today we're interviewing COVID Tweets, aka Prof. He's been around since the very beginning, and he has been immensely helpful. He's been our virtual buddy for a long time now, and he's a good guy. And I'm really honored to talk to him and hear his story, and I'm glad that you guys are tuning in to hear it too because it's important. I'm doing this intro outside of the podcast because my audio was a little funky at first, and giving credit where credit is due, Prof mentioned it. He said, "You sound a little echoey," although it doesn't sound echoey. It's a little clipped. And I said, "We'll be fine. It sounds like that all the time." In my defense, it does. In his defense, he was right. But he tells his story so well. I certainly wasn't going to go back and redo it. And I just edited out the beginning audio, it seemed to get better about a third of the way through. So apologies for a little bit of scratchy audio on my part, but he does most of the talking, which is great. So enjoy it. Here we go.
Right. Hello. First of all, Eric, thank you for having me on the show. It's great to be here with you, talk to you about my story. Uh, I am a professor in a college in North Carolina. I think that's all I'm comfortable with saying. And I've shared many times where I am, and people know that I'm a professor, so there's not much. Uh, I think I also probably can say I'm a parent, so maybe that's one thing that has uh, shaped my views on certain things. Yeah, I'm an anonymous professor in a college in North Carolina. So geographically, I was in North Carolina at the time as well.
Same job, same
Yes,
place.
I was in the same place. Politically, I think up until sometime in 2021, I would say or maybe late 2020, I'm not sure. I would say I was left leaning. So I was all about, justice and, rights and all of the things that the left politicians seem to care about. Uh, and I was also not very political at the same time. Like I was following things. I was like I was aware what was happening, who was the president. I'm not sure I knew who the. I mean, I knew who the governor was. I didn't know what kind of a person he was. So I wasn't really too much into politics. Uh, Again, I just had this mild left leaning worldview, I guess. Um, and I wasn't really active much on the social space either. I had a Twitter account. I was just following people. I wasn't really sharing much at the time. And
Same here.
yeah, and I started seeing this thing that was starting again, as you said. I'm not sure if I saw the first accounts in December or January, something like that in 2020. I started seeing the accounts of this new virus in China that people were talking about. So that's when I got interested in, and that sort of became the number one thing I started to follow at the time in January 2020. Without contributing much to the discussion myself, I was
So,
just following. Yeah,
so did you see it on Twitter?
I think yeah, it has to be because
Right.
I don't watch news. So
They-
Twitter is
yeah.
pretty much, yeah. I go to web for some news websites occasionally, but pretty much Twitter is where get my news from most of the time. So I'm pretty sure I learned about it on Twitter. I don't use other social media either. So
Yeah, you probably saw the same stuff. I agree. I mean, it wasn't in any mainstream, reporting. I think it was on Tucker Carlson like the second week of January, and there wasn't much there. I mean, I think that we just saw some of the footage, the people falling over, et cetera, and then later in January, I think Scott Gottlieb was the first one to write a more mainstream article. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, But you're right, like it wasn't anywhere else. And you probably, if you were on Twitter, even just following people, it's probably where you saw it. That's where I saw it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
again, I was someone who is not really politically inclined. Just most of the accounts I followed on Twitter at the time were about open science and people who are in my field, things like those used to be
Right.
what I. And if I commented on a tweet or something at the time, it would be about again open science studies. Methodological issues were big at the time, so those were the discussions I was most interested in. So I wasn't uh, really following much about politics or other things until the virus appeared the first time.
And what was your reaction? I mean, you saw it. Were you alarmed? Were you what was your take on it when you first saw it in January?
I don't remember really being too alarmed. I don't know why. I think when the data first started coming in pretty early on, the age distribution of fatalities was also available publicly. And I started looking at it. Maybe the first time I saw it, I may have been a bit apprehensive about okay, what is this thing now? Because we didn't know anything really early on, like in January and
Right.
February. I may have been a little apprehensive, but pretty soon after that, the data started coming in that showed that the age distribution was heavily skewed, like 80s. Of course, every life is precious. It doesn't mean the virus, was unimportant. But at the same time, I knew that personally, the risk to me was really low. So that I think was one of the early things that I found out about the virus that helped me put things into context from then on, like the age distribution, which is even now still so many people have no idea about. Like there are so many people even
Yeah.
now, more than 2 years later, who think that this is an equal opportunity killer, which is not even close. I think the first time it was really clear to me was when the data from Diamond Princess, the cruise ship, came out, which showed that despite the fact that there is really, in a cruise ship, in a cruise ship, the age distribution skews older usually, right?
Yes.
Despite that, the data came which showed, a lot of people didn't even show symptoms. Those who did, most of them recovered. Only maybe at the time, maybe six, seven. I don't remember the exact number. People had died.
That's right. That's right.
So that was crystal clear at the time, and this was a really good uh, case study, a natural experiment, even that in such a closed space
Oh
where
yeah.
people don't really have a lot of opportunities to socially distance. You're on a cruise ship, where are you going to distance? Uh, this was, this was the worst case to me. This was the worst case scenario. Like the virus infected the maximum number of people it could infect, and it ended up killing like six of them. Of course, again, that doesn't mean it's trivial. Uh,
Of
every
course.
life is important, but at the same time, it was really clear from that data that the reaction we started showing was disproportionate, massively disproportionate to what this thing was. Uh, that again, that I think helped me clear my mind about how I should respond personally. I knew my risk personally was low. Uh, my family, we don't have someone elderly living with us, so I knew the risk to my household was low, which told me that a lot of the things that later on we would be asked to do were really overkill. I think this data was really critical, and it was largely ignored. at the time, and even now, again, as I said, most people have no idea.
Totally agree. This was a big one for me as well. It was obviously a floating death tube. I mean, it was the worst case scenario in almost every aspect, right? It was the older demographic, excuse me, and we knew from even Italy at this point that older people were getting smacked, and this was a ship full of older and not to besmirch cruise enthusiasts, but sometimes the cruise populations aren't the healthiest people either, and so not only that, they were locked on this boat, and they ended up doing everything wrong. They didn't quarantine correctly. They didn't separate correctly. They kept, they kept mingling. They did the tango together. They had buffets, right? They mingled. They did all the same cruise stuff. They played canasta. You know what I mean? So they did. It was a very, very sloppy, poorly done quarantine with the highest risk population in a sealed environment. And to your point, the six people did die, and I think a couple more after that died, from extenuating circumstances. Again, these were old, at risk, compromised people. But to your point, it was the opposite of what was predicted. And I'm interested to know what you thought about the media's reaction to the Diamond Princess. How did you notice that? Did you notice at the time that they went from focusing very, very, very much on this, and then the moment it became clear that it was not going to be, mass death, the media lens moved on. Did you notice that at the time?
The media attention, you mean, increased
Yes.
even more after this? I mean,
No, it went like when we first heard about the Diamond Princess, right? The media was all over this. I mean, look at this shot. Like they
oh
were
yeah, yeah,
there,
yeah,
right?
yeah, I see
And
that.
but there became a point, a couple weeks in that it was not going. Thankfully, it was not going to be a mass death event,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And did you notice at the time that the media attention just sort of just
yeah,
sort of
yeah.
shifted away.
Yeah, I misunderstood you the first time. Yeah, of
Oh,
course. I
sorry.
mean, we have seen this several times throughout the pandemic. The media finds a poster child, expects that to be a death, event, like massive. How they treated Georgia the first time, for example, they opened up. They
Yep,
expect
that's true.
people dropping dead on the streets, and when that doesn't happen, they just move on. They don't even correct course and say this is what we were expecting, didn't happen. Why? That never happened with the media, and I think, yeah, this was, as you said, the first time maybe that the media expected some drastic tragedy, and when that didn't happen, they just pretended that it was never a thing.
Yeah. I mean, again, I wasn't trying to put words in your mouth, but this was a huge event for me, and I was personally very shocked. I guess in hindsight, I shouldn't have been, but when they just moved on without even acknowledging that it was again, it's not good news that six people died. But it is good. It was good news that this was not airborne Ebola, right? It was good news that this was not a 5% or even a 3%, infection fatality rate, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, they just whistled on past, didn't they? Oh my god.
And one of the big lessons that we should have taken from this at the time, given all the six people who died were in their 80s,
Yes.
that was the demographic we should have been the most concerned about from the very beginning. We never did that. And then, we are sort of moving in a timeline, but I'm going to skip a few months. When the Great Barrington Declaration came, that argued for exactly this, that we should be focusing on these people, the experts, the media, all everyone attacked, like, how dare you? But from this data, again, in February 2020, it was crystal clear that people in their 80s were the demographic. Yeah, uh, for deaths age 80, 87. That should have told us that those are the people we should be worrying about, and not other people. But somehow we sort of turn this into a mass, apocalypse level event that everyone will die, sort of thing.
We certainly did. And at this point, when Sarah Sawyer wrote this, which was late February, um, I remember there were only 4 deaths first, and then again there were a couple more afterwards because these are very old, in some cases infirm people. But so you saw this tweet and you saw the Diamond Princess and you were looking around going, is everybody taking crazy pills here?
Yeah, and to be honest, though, until like mid March ish, we were relatively sane. Uh, I don't know what shifted. Somewhere around March 11, 12, 13, 14. Maybe the governors, the White House, somebody received a briefing from someone, and then suddenly people went nuts. I'm thinking it could have been the Imperial College report, but it can't be because, or maybe they saw an early draft of the report. The report came out March, maybe like 16. Uh, that
The two
was,
the 2 million.
yeah, yeah. That came on, I think, March 16, 17, 18, maybe something like that. We had announced lockdowns before that. So maybe somebody gave a briefing with like an early draft of that report to the White House. Potentially, that's the case, like
to
March
to
12,
Berg
13, 14.
to Burks and Fauci, I would believe, because I think we know now that Trump wasn't aware of a lot of this until he was aware of it, and it was right before the lockdowns. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what we know now is that Fauci and Burks marched into Trump's office, into the Oval Office, with the Imperial College model projections of 2 million are going to die if we don't do this lockdown. And again, we lockdown plans which were done. Again, Trump did not have visibility or approval of this stuff until he was sort of accosted with the science by Trump or by Fauci and Burks. But you're right, like they must have gotten some sort of preliminary version of that model.
Yeah, again, it was sort of like overnight. I think, again, I was looking at early tweets. Probably March 12 or 13 is the date when that happened. And right after we started seeing all of these, we should lock down 15 days to slow the spread, I think came on March 15, maybe. So right before the Imperial College report was released, we had started going crazy.
Right.
Again, up until then, we were relatively measured. We were relatively sane. The schools were still on. I
Yep.
remember my child's teacher had asked for extra sanitizers for school. Right?
Right.
It sounds really reasonable. The assumption was we will keep going to school. There's this virus, but we will keep living. So maybe give us a few more hand sanitizers or something like that. And I kept that hand sanitizer for a long time. Actually, I had gotten a few, and I got it on a shelf. I kept those. I didn't use them on purpose, so they would remind me how we were sane, and we then went crazy. Uh, so yeah, up until like mid March, the schools were gonna be on. We went to spring break, thinking we would be coming back from spring break. Most of the colleges got caught into this during spring break, that we
Right.
got emails mid spring break saying, we won't be coming back, we will be remote. Uh, yeah, it happened so fast right after, around that time, that we suddenly the whole country went crazy. Even though nothing had changed, the substance, the virus, everything was the same. Just again, I think again it was likely because the 2 million report that the governors and the White House maybe received at the time, that they suddenly decided to flip the switch and shut the country down.
Yeah. Yeah, we got to find out what happened there for sure. Um, but so let's take a small step back into February. So you were aware of it, you were following it, and you're correct in that in February we hadn't lost our minds yet, right? We were treating this correctly, soberly,
Yeah,
rationally. But you specifically, right? You knew about it. Um, were you concerned in February? Did you think that we were underreacting in February, or were you aware of it enough? And you had, well, obviously the Diamond Princess was sort of toward the end of February, but what was your headspace in February? Were you wanting more government response, or what was your POV?
absolutely not. I never expect the governor to intervene at any point. Uh, in February, I think the data was clear that this was again an elderly 80 plus virus mostly. So personally, and maybe until really early on, until I saw the data, maybe I may have been a bit apprehensive. But after that, in February, I was really not concerned at all personally, and I wasn't really scared. I knew what it was. I wasn't expecting any kind of intervention, any kind of government response. I mean, we had started actually seeing some government response in February. I remember like a tent in the hospital parking lot that they had put up in case we would need beds, and I saw those, and I thought at the time they were, I guess, reasonable. And even then, I remember local. Uh, Maybe like local police, someone putting a statement saying, this is just a precautionary measure. Don't get panicked about the tent in the hospital parking lot.
Right.
People were still, recommending that we stay sane and calm. And again, behind the scenes, the the government was mobilizing to respond to a surge in hospitalizations in case that comes, but nobody was expecting or asking the people to put their lives on hold. So I thought at the time they were reasonable measures, right? If we need beds, we should make sure that we have them. Uh, I think at the time there was sort of this maybe like acceptance that this virus is coming. We should be prepared, but we shouldn't lose our minds at the same time. And I was really on board with that. Like, if the virus is coming, I will try to, of course, not get infected personally. But I also knew if I get, it wasn't, the worst thing that could happen. And I was also fully on board with the things that were happening at the time, like again, preparing for a surge in hospitalizations, which is not the first time. In flu seasons, people sometimes put up tents on hospital
Sure.
parking lots to deal with the surges in hospitalization. So there's not really anything new. What was new didn't come until mid March. Again, mid March is when we really begin losing our minds.
That is true. So tell me about this article, this idea, and I remember this vividly because I obviously probably responded to it as well because you have children. But Kawasaki, there was a mini scare of Kawasaki early on in the middle of the COVID scare, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things I mentioned to, we also were discussing with my students sometimes, like the students I were close to, we were, talking about this. And I remember mentioning to one of them about how we were really fortunate that kids were largely spared. I think this was in March or April, maybe in April, I don't remember for sure. I said if this was not, if kids were, if the mortality distribution was the opposite, I would be in a much different position in terms of what I was doing to protect myself or my family.
Same.
Uh, and I remember mentioning, we are really fortunate that's not the case. Then this Kawasaki disease reports began emerging like in late April, early May. I was following a guy on Twitter at the time. I don't remember his name. He sort of disappeared later. He would have been big. He was really a panic, you know, one of, not very different from a lot of those we have right now, but he was one of the people who were really um, promoting sort of panic at the time, I guess. And he was one of the first who began sharing about this. And I, as a parent, I got concerned. I thought, is this really the case? What should we do? Like, how can we protect ourselves? That was, I think, the only time I was really personally concerned and scared. Not personally, but for my kids. I was scared when the first reports of this began emerging. I was not sure how prevalent this would be, how deadly this would be, then, as we got more data, it appeared that this wasn't a big risk either. It was rare and it was really easy to catch early on and it was easily treatable. So I got calm again, I guess. Uh, but I think it's going to be a common theme that I sort of waited for the data. And when the data came, I looked at what it was telling me and I adjusted my views accordingly. So this was an example. Again, I was concerned at first, and then data came and I got relief. Same thing about, we will talk about lockdowns and masks and all those. Early on, I wasn't really super against many of the measures. Of course, I thought, for example, masks would work. I admit that. I thought they would work.
I did
But
too.
then when the data came, they didn't. I said, then it's nonsense. Like, why are we doing this? So yeah, this was a good example to have. First reports emerged, and then data came, and I adjusted my priors, my views. I think the biggest issue throughout the pandemic was because people had lost the ability to update their views and
That's
behaviors
right.
based on data.
That's right.
Like, they stuck to a viewpoint, they stuck to a belief, and regardless of the amount of data coming in, they never changed those views. And that became the plague, really, in itself, that caused all of the harms that we are going to be seeing for the years to come.
Totally agree. Totally agree. It's a pattern, and it's a bad pattern.
Yeah.
And interestingly, it's you and I have definitely some parallels here because I remember this vividly. I had the same concerns. I had gone through a very similar trajectory as you. I was probably a little bit more freaked out than you were at first, but then I saw Italy Diamond Princess, and I was like, okay, this is not the Black Plague. Um, and then this came out, and to your point, it was like, well, I wasn't really worried about my kids before, but oh no, this could be concerning. And as you mentioned, this wrapped up fairly quickly. I think that we saw that this Kawasaki. I remember this Kawasaki thing having like a 2 or 3 week life cycle, and then we almost like the Diamond Princess, we just moved on. Right? They didn't investigate why they were. There was no inward investigation of the media. They just moved on. Right? They made a big thing about this, and then they didn't. Right?
Yeah.
There was no honesty here about like, hey, we got this wrong, or hey, this was exaggerated, or whatever. No, they just moved on and they pretended like they never did this. And one interesting thing, and I cannot find this, by the way, but I was following this pretty closely, and I remember a couple weeks into the Kawasaki thing, there was an article or study out of Japan, I think, and it was talking about how they found evidence that these Kawasaki symptoms, and again, it was never Kawasaki disease, it was Kawasaki like symptoms, right?
Yeah.
And I remember vividly this article, and I did not save it. And to this day, I'm mad at myself for not saving it. But it actually tied these symptoms to over sanitization, right? Over an overuse of hand sanitizer, chemical cleaners, all this stuff. Again, who knows if that's the case, but put that on the list of things that we didn't investigate properly, right? We just moved on.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, people really didn't think through a lot of this stuff, and I've seen that in my discussions with my colleagues as well. Like people were really, they just did what they were told. They never questioned. They never investigated the sanitizing thing. I remember having a discussion about it with one of my colleagues at the time, like in a meeting. I think maybe, or maybe it was on an email chain. I don't remember. Someone was criticizing the administration of my school for not doing sanitization sufficiently. Like they were not sanitizing the doorknobs or uh, the rails. I don't know, something like that. And then when I responded with data showing that this is not, that sanitizing surfaces won't make any difference because that's not how the virus spreads. The response I got was, still I would feel more safe. I would feel better if they did that. Like
Safe.
why? Yeah, like if it's not helping, why? Like why would we spend our resources on useless, you know, sanitizing? Another thing I wanted to say, when you mentioned about people being really scared early on, and since we are talking about origin stories, I think that's relevant. I also attribute some of this, like some of how I stayed calm, to my personal background. I have a really non-traditional background. I have seen stuff, so I guess that's also like how I was able to stay calm. Like I attribute some of this panic. It was in one of my threads, I think, late 2020. I attribute some of this panic to, actually a lot of this panic, to how the society has been, used to living in very safe conditions. They never experienced something like this before. For a lot of people, this was the first time when they really were scared of dying, because we now live in a
It's
really
true.
safe society. Even 100 years ago, a lot of the things that killed us no longer exist. So we just live in this super safe bubble, like most of the society. But then something like this happens, which may be coming for you, then people freaked out. That didn't apply to me because, again, my background is a bit different. I think that also helped me stay calm.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Um, Absolutely. So, just a super quick question. When did you first hear the phrase flatten the curve?
March, around mid
In
March.
in March. And
Yeah.
what did you think?
So, to be honest, I didn't really. So, the measures that people were arguing for, the first time flatten the curve thing came out, I think were not really as drastic as what we ended up doing. Uh, so early
It's
on,
about
I
the
wasn't.
hospitals.
Yeah, so I wasn't really against the idea at the time. Like, if there's a way to, minimize the number of people who will be infected at the same time, so that the hospitals would have enough beds, then why not? That was my initial reaction. But then, and this is something I want to talk about as well, the models were projecting like 400,000 hospitalizations per day, like some ridiculous number. I don't remember right now.
Yeah, they were.
But then the real numbers, even on the day the model was published, the real numbers were not matching the numbers that the models were predicting. So the
Not even
models were
close.
wrong on the day they
Way
were
wrong.
published.
Way wrong.
Very wrong. And again, on the date, like, models should at least start from from the right baseline. Like, if there are like 10 hospitalizations today, let's apply these parameters and see what's going to happen a month from now. They even started wrong. And then, of course, they stayed wrong. So, again, my initial reaction was, yeah, this is a good idea. We should try to minimize the number of people who will need those beds at once so we can have, capacity. But then again, the data came showing that that's never going to happen. Like, hospitals will be able to handle the surge just fine. Then I started changing my tone about the measures that were being implemented at the time, because again the data was showing they were not necessary, but we were still doing things based on those models. This is actually an email I sent to IHME modelers at the time. I was super nice, as you can see in my language. The model was showing this many beds. That's not the case. These are the real numbers. Is the model overestimating the number of beds needed? And then I also criticized how the model was treating New York and Wyoming the same, despite the fact that New York and Wyoming. So I saw with some issues at the time, and I tried to raise my voice to the extent possible. Of course, I was a nobody, so I didn't expect to be taken seriously. But at the same time, I wanted to try to at least get my message across. But again, the data once again kept coming that showed that a lot of the things we were doing were not necessary, even in March. Uh, so that's when I started updating my views, like from yeah, maybe this may be helpful to looks like we're overreacting to this around March, late March timeframe.
Well, good for you for writing. I certainly did my share of that, but you're right. It was to say it fell on deaf ears is putting it lightly. Like they just did not care.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
did
Their
not care
their
at all.
models, none of the models, I think, even approached being right throughout the 2 years that we have seen models. Because they never model for seasonality. I think that was the number one big issue that they were ignoring. They never model for seasonality. And that was another thing that helped shape my views early on. That was an article that came in March that showed that the virus was spreading the most within a certain temperature humidity profile.
Right.
Uh, and that article sort of was consistent with my uh, observations as well, because I was seeing how the virus was sort of like flaring up around the same time at a certain place. It didn't look like it cared about how people behaved. Again, it was obvious early on. It didn't look like things we do were gonna make a lot of difference. This
Virus gonna
was
virus.
Yeah, this was regional, seasonal. The best we could do was, again, as I said, I was on board with the things that we did to preserve hospital beds, which then proved to be unnecessary. Whatever people did, the based on the geography, based on the season, the virus would do its thing, and then it was gonna peak and then go down when the environmental conditions change. The models never never used this in their estimations.
Right.
Uh, Even until like late 2021, even maybe until early this year, we didn't see a lot of acknowledgement that the virus was seasonal. Uh, so I think that was one big reason why the models were really wrong. They were based on faulty assumptions about the seasonality, also about transmission. They were based on droplet transmission models that were made early on, I think, and then we over time found out that's not the case. They were also based on uh, a lack of acknowledgement that a lot of people wouldn't even be showing symptoms, and that they sort of assumed that everyone who get infected would be sick and this percentage would get hospitalized. So they massively overestimated hospitalizations because of faulty assumptions, and that was really clear very early on, again in March, that prompted me to write that email. and
Agreed.
and when you sort of see the data showing that you know these are not going to happen. This model says we will have 2 million people dying or within this time frame. I think the model was putting those deaths within a few months even.
Yes, it did.
And hospitalizations, crazy numbers showing we would need like
Yep.
800,000 beds in hospitals, things like those. The models kept coming out, uh, painting these apocalypse scenarios, but then the reality didn't match what the models were telling was going to happen. So I quickly updated my views after that, and then I started seeing, okay, like, why are people not updating their views, and uh, why are people not pivoting to maybe different measures? We now see that this is not going to be as bad as we feared. Okay, so now maybe stop doing lockdowns. Why are we still doing lockdowns? That sort of was what prompted me to sort of this online activist role, I guess. That when I saw, despite the fact that data was crystal clear, people were still reacting like they lost their minds, I had to do something. I had to say something. Again, emails wouldn't work. I wrote a couple emails. Again, they wouldn't make any difference. I was complaining about this massive overreaction to my wife, and I guess I was over complaining, so she got angry at me at some point, said like, why are you telling this to me? I'm not responsible. So I turned to Twitter, and early on I was still using my personal account with my name, and I was tweeting stuff, but then I started worrying about maybe tweeting things that could put me in a difficult position with my institution. I had a job that
Sure.
I wanted to keep. So I started this account, I think, early summer 2020, and started using it as an outlet to share my frustrations with the fact that, again, despite the data telling otherwise, people still sticking to the lockdowns narrative.
So you were using your personal account through the spring, but you had seen, like we all saw, people being, canceled, censored, bullied, fired, punished for
Yeah,
going against the narrative. And you had obviously been following, sort of the original, Team Reality accounts at that point. Like, a lot of it had sort of, appeared, right?
yeah,
And so then you took on your own. You created a new COVID, because your COVID tweets, So
yeah,
that definitely came out of COVID, and you started that in the summer, right? No, so the summer. So we get through the spring. You guys were closed down. Your university was closed down. Your kids were out of school and never went back to school, just like everybody else's kids. And here we come tumbling into the summertime. You knew about seasonality, as did most of us. And personally, I thought everybody knew about seasonality before this, but everybody conveniently forgot about it. But we're going into summer, and to your point, not only are we not looking at the data, not looking at the fact that these models were wildly, awfully inaccurate. And in my mind, it's like, hey, we can stop doing this crazy stuff. They were doubling and tripling down just in time for summer, right? They were closing playgrounds, they were closing beaches, they were canceling summer camps. So where were you when that started happening? When obviously you started your own Twitter account to make your voice heard and be public and start activating. But where were you and your family at this point in terms of when the summer came around?
so we were increasingly frustrated, of course, with the fact that the school was, closed, and I saw really early on that the remote school was going to be a disaster
Oh
because,
yeah,
I watched my own child doing remote school, and I knew how that was not really school. Um, I was really frustrated that the playgrounds were still closed, which was really not necessary because even then we sort of knew, and that was not really a big secret at the time, that outdoors risk was low. This was openly acknowledged even by the experts at the time. So despite that, the playgrounds were still closed.
Yep.
So I was really frustrated. I was increasingly frustrated with the fact that, despite the data keeps coming in telling us some of the things that we do are not necessary and harmful measures, we were still doing those. Uh, and I was also frustrated that a lot of the things we were doing were hurting the low income people the most. Like when you close playgrounds,
Yep.
families who can afford them can put a playground in their backyards, or they can buy, games. They can still keep their kids entertained and happy, but the low income people rely on those places for their kids to to have some good times. So when you close playgrounds, when you close schools, the people who don't have the means uh, have suffered the biggest impact. uh, so that also, I think, began shaping my views about how there was this disconnect between uh, how half of the country was experiencing this and the other half was experiencing this. Like one half was really fine. They saw this as like a fun little experiment in which they were
Did, didn't they?
catching up on Netflix, shows, and I was seeing people on sharing, the bread recipe they tried that day, or things like those.
Oh yeah.
Then the other half was suffering because they had lost their jobs, they had, their kids were out of school, they couldn't take their kids to playgrounds, everything was closed, and I really began getting increasingly frustrated, and also realized how unjust all of this was around that time to low income families and kids. Uh, and I started arguing for an end to those measures as soon as possible, as much as I could with my voice at the time.
Right. Right. And so you said that previously you weren't super political, but you were left leaning. You were interested in concepts like social justice and things like this. What was your reaction to the BLM riots that took place over the summer and were allowed to happen? Um,
Yeah.
Even though the rest of us couldn't go outside, they were allowed to go outside and riot.
So um, I wasn't against the protests. Riots are different, of course. I
I
sort
wasn't
of
against
make
the
a
protests
distinction.
either, frankly.
I sort of make a distinction between them. The protests that are really actually peaceful, I was fine with them, and I also supported because despite COVID, that people were able to do those because I knew the risk was low. So I was
Yeah,
arguing
totally
for
agree.
resuming normal activities all along.
Absolutely.
So when
I thought
those
I
started,
actually super quick. I actually thought that they might kickstart us back
yeah,
into normalcy in a way,
Exactly.
right?
That was my thought as well. Like I
Yeah.
thought maybe after this, people would realize, life could resume. And again, riots are a different thing, but the actual peaceful ones, I wasn't really against them. Uh, but then when I saw the same people, promoting, encouraging these gatherings, then saying different things on other gatherings, then that's when I sort of started, seeing the hypocrisy in
Yeah.
the politics of this as well. And again, I also was seeing how this was hurting the low income poor kids the most, but nobody seemed to care. So I think that was when I started updating my views on who was actually rooting for social justice and who was not, and how social justice is nice until it is against the other thing that's that's big at the time, then it can easily be sacrificed.
Yeah.
So those were the big things that sort of started my journey flow from, I guess, left leaning to uh, I would now, I think, define myself as right of center. I would still wouldn't say I'm solid far right, but I'm certainly right of center right now. And those were the big things that started kick started my process from politically left leaning to right leaning.
Interesting. I had the same reaction about the overall social justice element of the pandemic response, right? Which, and I think you just said it, which is, a lot of the people that perpetuated lockdowns and caused these harms that were exponentially incurred by lower income minorities, the very classes and kinds of people and population and cultures that these people claim to care so much about, right? And when
Yeah,
you see these real world, real time harms to these exact populations, and we're screaming our heads off like these people are suffering, they're being harmed by these things. The people who previously claimed to care so much about these people are sitting behind their laptops, binge watching Netflix and trading bread recipes and saying, you stay indoors. You need to comply. You're completely ignoring the societal harms that they're causing. It blew my mind. You
yeah,
really, and to your point, it is hypocrisy. There's no other word for it. And I didn't, I personally didn't think it could get that deep, right? It was so blatant and so awful. And I still am shocked by it, frankly.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And it's still happening. Still the
it
same thing
absolutely
happening.
is. Yep. And it will continue to happen until we put a firm stop to this. So that was the summer. Were you able to get your kids into any sort of camp, or did you guys hunker down sort of as a family for the summer?
We weren't able to do any camps or things like those over the
Oh,
summer.
sorry.
Yeah, we did as much outdoor stuff as possible, like hiking and
Sure.
things like those, so that I at least my kids would have some physical activity, fresh air, things like those.
Right.
Um, and we also were able to get a playset with a couple neighbors. We put up a playset for
Oh,
the
nice.
neighborhood kids in this on on an empty lot,
Great.
and that also helped keep the kids occupied and entertained. But again, we were able to afford this. A lot of people, didn't
That's
have
true.
these opportunities. So no camps, no, we didn't even take a vacation at the time because everything was closed or
That's
would be
right. Neither did
closed, or
we.
there would be lots of restrictions. So we said, it's not going to be worth it. So we just hunkered down throughout the summer and did small family stuff as much as we could.
Yeah. Same here. I think most people were in the same boat.
Yeah,
And then school started in the fall, and I'm assuming both you and your children were remote.
I wasn't. So when the school
Really?
started, when the
Nice.
school started in the fall, yeah, my kids were remote. They actually was going to be, so the school in North Carolina was going to be like a hybrid at first. Like I think the governor came up with this plan ABC and gave options to the school districts to
I
choose
think I,
from.
I think I remember the North Carolina because we were all looking at other states' plans for the fall. I think I remember this.
Yeah, so plan A, B, C, I don't remember the specifics, but it was like fully remote, fully in person, and I'm not sure if they gave the option to fully in person, but there was this hybrid sort of option, which was uh, 2 days, I think, in school and then 2 days remote. And then they would switch, like, because they also had to do social distancing, they had to stay 6 feet apart, that's 6 feet. So I think, yeah, I don't remember. I don't think that was this fully in person option, but they had remote versus hybrid maybe, because fully in person would mean that no 6 feet, which was the end of the civilization at the time.
All
So
right.
they had to do 6 feet. Uh, the school district we in our school district was supposed to start with the hybrid one, but then the cases started rising in the summer again, and they shifted to fully remote for the first few months. I don't remember how long. My school gave the option to teach in person or hybrid or remote, and uh, most of the students and professors were remote. I insisted on in person. Uh, but I also knew that a lot of and I also knew a lot of the students wouldn't be comfortable with in person, or they would prefer remote because of some other reasons as well. Uh, and even with in person, we had reduced capacity because of the 6 feet thing. So a classroom which would hold 50 people were only allowed to have like 20 at the time. So the best I could do was I did hybrid classes in the fall. So I uh, was in person on campus teaching, but I also had my lectures live streamed.
Right.
So I gave the students the option to do whatever they wanted. A few of them came in person, most of
Oh,
them
nice.
didn't. But at least I gave my students the option, and I
Great.
knew that it was important for at least a few people who couldn't function online. Um, but I was almost alone in this. Most of my colleagues chose to stay remote throughout 2020 2021 academic year. They were fully remote, and most people. But the only time I was fully remote was after they shut it down, spring 2020, and then again, as soon as I could, I went back to teaching in person in the fall. And I remember tweeting about it. It was sort of like a funny tweet. I am still alive. Can someone check in on me 2 weeks just in case? Uh,
Just wait 2 weeks.
yeah, who knows? But I did teach in person, and I'm sort of proud that I did that.
Right.
After that, I sort of realized that maybe for some students, they just didn't care, uh, because college students, right? They Some of them care about classes and grades and GPA. Most of them don't. To them, remote school is just school that they don't have to go. They some of them watched the recordings. A lot of them didn't. Uh, some of them read the assigned readings. A lot of them didn't. A lot of them, the exams were also, of course, I had to, despite the fact that I was teaching in person, I had to do my exams online because I couldn't, bring all my students in a room to do in-person exams.
Right.
So exams had to be online, which was really easy to cheat, despite whatever you can do to stop them from cheating. I'm sure a lot of them were comfortably cheating. So for many students, they really didn't learn much last 2020 2021. For many students, it was just a year that they did some school in which they just had to take a few exams, and in those they probably cheated as much as they could and got the highest grades they could with that. So I tried to, again, minimize that to the extent possible, but my hands were tied. I just was able
Sure.
to give the option to the students at least who wanted the in-person structure, but I couldn't do much other than that. My hands were tied.
Well, good for you for doing it. I mean, I think you're right. Like most students across the nation didn't learn anything, for
Yeah,
those 2 years. I mean,
and we
it's
are seeing it now. Like the things that they should have learned last year, like
yep.
they just don't know them. Uh, for example, research methods is a really important class for a lot of some of the other classes that they learn in as they go up in their studies. They need to learn research methods, And some of the more advanced classes use some of the knowledge that they've gained in research methods.
Right.
They have no idea,
Oh, good.
because they did research methods online, and they didn't really learn much.
Yay. Ugh,
Yeah,
what a nightmare.
yeah,
Well, I mean, at least you were, you know, stepping your foot back into some form of normalcy, and kudos to the kids that actually came in physically. And it's
yeah,
cool that your university allowed that to happen, because many didn't. Many didn't allow people to come back in at all.
yeah. I actually, uh, I have more praise than criticism to North Carolina's governor. He did a lot of wrongs, especially early on, but then he wasn't. Maybe he was the best Democrat governor, or among the best, I guess,
Right.
Democrat governors, in terms of how he did as much hands off as possible. He gave a lot of the decisions to local administrations and schools and all of those, which I think was good, because even though some of the regions lost their minds and they did much more drastic
Right.
restrictions than the governor would have done. A lot of the other places at least had the option to do some things in more normal ways. And again, I think that was again a really positive thing that the governor of North Carolina did. Some people criticize for not doing more, but given the realities of politics and party affiliations, I think he did the best he could in it, at least giving the options to do some things normally.
I do agree. I mean, I think the local decision making and control is where it's at. It's where it should be. You have the flip side, right? And DeSantis dealt with this in Florida, right, where you open the state up, but you allow local control, and you are going to have local areas that are super COVIDian, super restrictive, and that's very unfortunate. But um, I agree with you. I think it's better than having the state, the top down decrees, because each area is different. Whether or not geographically, to your point from before, it's almost like New York versus Wyoming, but like the counties are different, the schools are different, and obviously the populations and their politics are different, which can skew the other way, right? Which can trap people in bad situations, but nothing is perfect. And at the local level, at the very least, we have the ability to advocate in a personal way that we really don't have once you crawl up the ladder, right? It gets harder to do on a county level. It gets harder to do on a state level. It's increasingly harder to do on a national level. So I agree with you, and I do think that North Carolina was. I mean, maybe Polis in Colorado was a slightly better Dem governor, but you're right. I think that North Carolina, in terms of a Dem leadership, was not the worst,
Yeah,
for sure.
and you can also see it in the outcomes. Really, now the data keeps coming in, and you can actually see the results, right?
Yeah.
North Carolina consistently ranks among the top Democrat states. States with Democrat governors, not Democrat states. It's like it's a purple state, but at least in terms of governor affiliations, it consistently ranks close to the top in terms of economic outcomes, and also mortality is also quite low compared to some of the other Democrat states. So more hands off, not losing your mind. I think that approach has helped North Carolina to suffer the least damage possible compared to some of the other states.
Well, good for you guys. Congratulations. All right, so let's skip forward through the fall a little bit. I have something here that you might think is cool, and that is your Twitter page from December 16th, 2020. I
Yeah.
love this, the Wayback Machine. You got a slightly different banner image.
Yeah,
Um,
I kept that banner image until the book came out, and then I changed it to the book.
Sorry about this login screen here. I can't get rid of it. But let's see, your pinned tweet was from October 4th. It says, remember how when people were protesting lockdowns, many were suggesting that the protesters needed to waive their rights to healthcare. We need the lockdown proponents to do the same, waive their rights to use essential services. Here, I made it easy for them. This is interesting. What was your idea behind this?
Yeah, I mean, it was all one-sided, right? Like if you want to live your life, you need to also waive your rights to get a hospital bed if you get sick. That was a sort of somewhat common argument at the time, like when people were protesting lockdowns. Some people were saying, if you get sick, you can't use healthcare, you can't use hospitals. You are waiving your rights by doing this. Then the flip side is also true, right? Like if you are arguing for shutting down services, shutting down life, then you should also be comfortable with living, on your own means independently. You shouldn't expect people to bring you utilities and water and power and food. Like you should be comfortable doing those things by yourself. Like if you are arguing for shutting down life and ending all of those services, then why not just we do it for good and you live by your own means. That was sort of the argument behind this tweet.
You kind of put your money where your mouth is.
Sorry, what?
You put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
gotta,
right.
yeah. This is your book, your wonderful, wonderful book, which is available on Amazon, by the way. Everybody out there should buy it. But you started collecting the statements and the tweets and the thoughts of people like yourself who came out publicly, looked at the data, looked at the stats, looked at the evidence, and made the case and made the alternative case, right, against the lockdowns, against all this. So
Yeah.
when did you get the idea for this book? When did you start collecting these tweets?
To be honest, I didn't collect the tweets throughout. I paid attention, of course, and I knew they were important. I knew what was going on was important. Uh, I am probably one of the strongest advocates of calling ourselves Team Reality. So I thought that this collection of anonymous, semi-anonymous, or not, maybe not anonymous, but random individuals from different backgrounds, different places, different political leanings, coming against this narrative and sharing arguments against the COVID measures, restrictions, masks, things like those, by sharing the data, showing they don't work, they harm, all of those. I thought that was really important, that this random, cohort came together and started fighting against uh, the the restrictions. I paid attention, but I didn't really collect the tweets in real time. And then actually sometime early this year, or yeah, maybe January this year, I don't remember for sure. I had this idea that maybe we should do something about keeping them, because I personally, I'm still not sure what I'm gonna do. People keep pushing back, but I had this plan that I would deactivate my account when COVID is no longer, which proved to be more optimistic than it sounds.
Yeah,
But
that's never going to happen.
yeah, so I had this idea that I would deactivate my account when life is normal again. Yeah. So and what I thought is, like, when I do that, the tweets would all go away, and I didn't really think twice about it for a long time. Like I said, who cares? My tweets will go away. Okay, it's fine. I think at some point I said maybe I will personally download them to keep them to show my kids or something like that. But I didn't really think too hard about it. But then I realized not just my tweets, a lot of people's tweets would somehow disappear, or even if they don't disappear, they would just be lost. And as time goes by, like 10 years from now, no one's gonna find those tweets that we have been sharing with data and facts and all those. So I thought maybe we could do something about it, and maybe we could find a way to keeping them for good, not necessarily to read them right now. I actually think the book isn't really for people to read right now, even though people who purchased the book share that they're reading it. I don't think we should be reading it now. It's for the future, for when this is long forgotten and something like this happens again. We should remember that what happened right now was really not normal, and some people did their best to at least fight against it. And also, as long as there is at least one person who fights against it, other people will soon gain courage to begin speaking up against the irrational decisions as well. So I think the book is important in showing that historically what happened first, like the insanities that were done in the name of COVID measures. So I think the book will be important because it has some good pictures showing the kind of insane things that we did. Uh, because it's going to be unbelievable. Like at some point, we will. Even now, I'm sort of thinking back and say, last year this time there was a guy waiting at the door of Walmart counting people who go in. Like, how crazy is this? you know, uh, 5 years from now, it'll look even more crazy. And I think it was important to memorialize those things that were done in the name of COVID safety. And at the same time, that people did their best to fight against it. And in many cases, even if it took a while, we succeeded, I think. So I think it's important in the sense that it'll give uh, people in the future maybe like a guide or a way or at least the courage to speak up. So I thought that's why it was really important to keep them for historical record, if not for anything. And that's how the idea came, and that's when I started, working on it.
Yeah, it's great, and I agree with everything that you said. It's kind of like the historical record. Twitter is, for a large degree, the public square, right? It's where the conversation takes place. It's where public opinion is formed for the most part. And you're right. There was a collection of randos from all walks of life who stuck their necks out to the extent that they could. Again, some of us are totally out there. Some of us are sort of half anonymous, and some of us have to be totally anonymous. But we still did everything that we could to battle against this stupidity, this insanity. And I'm so glad that you did this. I think I was so glad to help in any way I could, and also the fact that it's published and it's out there is just it feels like it's important and will have an important historical place. So hats off.
Yeah,
Thank you for doing it.
I certainly agree. Again, I thought it was too important. People are getting banned from Twitter. When somebody gets banned, you just lose all
You lose
their
everything. Well,
tweets.
that's right, and that's interesting because I know that you mentioned that you didn't you you knew that people were might deactivate their accounts, right, and the tweets would be gone. But interestingly, you managed to capture Michael Singer's tweets in this book, and he's gone. Like, you can't get those tweets anywhere else except
Yeah,
for this book, which is really scary, which is not cool. I mean,
and then
I'm glad that you did it. I'm glad you were able to capture. And obviously, you only have a couple dozen of his in you. You couldn't grab everything, but like his presence is gone.
Yeah, and every one of us, every person in this book, I think has a unique role that they played. Every person had a unique role, had an argument, had a story to tell. I tried to make sure that the tweets I get from each person's account would reflect their main contribution to the extent possible. So, for example, Michael's most important contribution was, I think, how he exposed the China's role in promoting this
Absolutely.
panic, and the tweets I grabbed reflect that. There is also real developments who got banned after I
Right.
was able to capture some tweets from as well. Who knows who else is gonna get banned? Maybe I will get banned today. Who knows?
Could be
So
me.
that's why I think another reason why it's important is the tweets can easily be taken away, but the book, as long as people have copies of it, will stay forever. So I think it's really critical that we had this physical product that can be kept forever.
Well, it was a labor of love, and you can tell it's well done, it's well put together, and your choices are great. So again, thank you for doing this. I think it's going to hang around for a while.
That's the goal. That it should hang around for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, we've gone for an hour and a half, and I'd actually love to have you back and to actually go through the book and kind of talk about the tweets and the thoughts behind them and the people behind them, because I think that would be really interesting as well. But I wanted to thank you for joining me today, because just like the book, the personal stories of the people in this book, right? The people who, again, stuck their necks out, and again, I think are gonna be the people who help us get out of this madness, right? I think if you hadn't spoken up, if I hadn't, like, if we hadn't done what we could, right, in each in our own way, I don't know if we would be where we are right now. Again, we're not in a perfect place. We're not out of this yet. There's still so much, stupidity to deal with, and there's still so many They're trying to bring masks back, to New York City. I mean, it's never ending. But I don't think that we would be as far along in a positive direction that we are if Team Reality hadn't gotten out there and done what we did.
Yeah, I certainly agree. Again, that's why it's also an important lesson for future generations that I am usually critical of social media. I think it is doing more harm than good for the society. People may disagree with me. I think this is not a very popular opinion, but that's my opinion that social media, we would be in a better place if it never existed, I think.
I
But
think a lot of people would agree with you on that. I don't. I think I would disagree a little bit, but I don't think you're alone in that.
but then there are some good things that come out of it, like this, for example. You may argue that I think I argue that social media is one of the big reasons we got into this mess in the first place. But then it was also instrumental in helping us get out of this mess. So
That's
you could
right.
argue that there are also some benefits from social media. And I think this was certainly one of them.
Totally agree. Yeah, it's a double edged sword for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Prof, thank you so much for spending an hour and a half with me of your time. I know it's valuable.
You're
Um,
welcome. You're very
and
welcome.
thank you.
I was happy to be on here with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I mean, you're one of the key voices that we've had, and it is so important to get your personal story again, because not to be a broken record, but like the personal journeys are the underpinning of of the story of, and it's going to be the reason out of this eventually, to what you said earlier. So again, my hat's off to you. Thank you for all your hard work, and best of luck to you and your family, and I hope you guys stay happy and healthy and sane.
Thank you. Yeah, likewise.
All
Good to
right.
be here.
All right, well, thank you, and until the next one, Team Reality. Whoop, whoop.